Australia's Indigenous fashion sector is gathering momentum. Events such as this month's Darwin Aboriginal Art Fair now have so much fashion content, they're rapidly emerging as de facto Indigenous fashion weeks.
Meanwhile, a growing number of established Australian fashion labels are also seeking out collaborations with Indigenous artists. To discuss this and other industry news, we're joined now by fashion journalist Patty Huntington. Good to see you again,
Good
Patty.
morning.
What are we seeing emerge in the Indigenous fashion sector?
Well, look, this fashion segment on Weekend Breakfast has actually been going since 2012, and we've talked about Indigenous fashion on a number of occasions. But I've got to say, over the past 12 months, I think there's huge momentum. There just seems to be this growing sort of groundswell of goodwill and people wanting to get into the space. And the Darwin Aboriginal Art Fair, that was the 13th edition, but it's the fourth time they've had a fashion show. And in fact, the second year in a row where they've added a second show due to popular demand. So, and there's more and more collaborations with non-Indigenous designers. Like at the fair we had collaborations with Lisa Gorman in Melbourne with the Mankadja Art Centre, and another Melbourne designer by the name of Ingrid Werner with an Indigenous artist by the name of Lisa Walp. So we're seeing much more of a kind of, cross-cultural collaboration happening, and then movements happening within the Indigenous space. Back in 2014, there was the first Australian Indigenous Fashion Week, which unfortunately only lasted one edition because it sort of collapsed in debts. But I think there's other people coming through, such as Grace Lillian Lee, who was mentored for that event, and she's going out into the remote communities and mentoring people, and she's just launched a new talent incubator called First Nations Fashion and Design. So that's probably the beginning, I think, of an Indigenous Fashion Council.
We're seeing some pictures now of some of the Indigenous fashions and they look amazing.
Really amazing. And look, this fair, for example, it's the largest Indigenous art fair in Australia. 2,000 artists from over 70 centres. I mean, there's this incredible resource of these artists across Australia. I mean, most of them, I imagine, probably are just self-taught, but I mean, incredible sense of design, incredible sense of colour, and fantastic applications with, for fashion designers. And also, there are more and more Indigenous designers coming through design schools. I mean, Grace Lillian Lee, for example, is an RMIT graduate, and she also does these beautiful hand-woven sort of neck pieces and body sculptures that come from her sort of Torres Strait Islander sort of weaving techniques. So, I mean, really interesting stuff. And if you look back, 2012, an American brand by the name of Rodarte created quite a fuss at New York Fashion Week where they used Indigenous designs. And now they didn't say where they came from. And in fact, claimed they came out of nowhere and from a book, and I myself wrote about that, and questions were asked, well, where has it come from? Is this just cultural appropriation? It turned out they actually had licensed them, but they didn't want to talk about who it was. So now we're seeing more of these collaborations.
I guess with the collaborations as well, it can be a real launch pad because these designers would already have an established name, and so to collaborate with them, it just launches you onto a new stage, I guess.
Of course, and I mean, if you look at some of the garments, I mean, that we were showing in the pictures, I mean, these are really quite beautiful. I mean, prints, I mean, where do you get prints from? You have either you buy them at an international, fabric fair, or you have them developed by your own graphic artist at great expense. I mean, it doesn't get much more Australian than Indigenous art. And, I mean, it just has the sense of colour and design in these things, and it's almost limitless. But I think, what's important here is the sort of self-determination and the fact that they are having discussions and trying to organise. And the Australian Fashion Council is now moving to help them establish what are the sort of the problems and how to take this forward. I should point out that Australian Fashion Week, there's been a couple of Indigenous fashion shows there, I think from Desert Designs, Kui Swimwear, in 24 years. They're the only two I can recall. But what there really does need to be is some kind of Indigenous fashion showcase. At New Zealand Fashion Week, which is next week, they've had a Maori fashion showcase for the past 10 years. Now, in 2008, they launched the Maori Apparel Fashion Board, which is called Miramoda, and they do a competition every year to work out which designers are going to show at New Zealand Fashion Week. And this year they're actually showing 12, but there's other fashion designers, Maori designers, showing at the event. And it's a different conversation in New Zealand where the Maori and Pacific Islander culture is much more sort of visible than it is in the major cities in Australia.
But certainly Australia could work on the New Zealand model and try and institute some of those factors to boost boost Indigenous fashion?
In more ways than one. I mean, and interestingly, as we are moving forward, you know, this conversation about sort of Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, I mean, it's almost a soft power that's developing. And I mean, I believe the Darwin Aboriginal Art Fair has generated something like $10 million in art sales over the past 5 years, I think it is. But I mean, if you can consider the commercial application and potential for design artists to sell their artworks to establish non-Indigenous designers and companies, in Australia and internationally, and then also for these artists to develop their own companies. I think the sky's the limit.
It's not just that we're seeing more of this diversity in the designers, but it's also on the runways with the models as well.
Well, and we talk about this every time we talk about the international collections, that the focus on diversity is becoming greater and greater, particularly at New York Fashion Week, not so much in Paris. New Zealand Fashion Week, interestingly, this year has really done a push for diversity, and the founder, Dame Pieta Stewart, has asked designers to please try and here's a model at a casting in a wheelchair to include diversity not just in ethnicity but in age, body type, gender identity. I believe there are 100 volunteers with various disabilities. There's going to be a fashion show modelled by 15 models with intellectual disabilities, and there's a fantastic initiative called All Is for All, which was launched in March by a young, I think she was the Young New Zealander of the Year in 2017, Grace Stratton. And it's a website, it's an e-commerce site specialising in fashion for people with sort of mobility issues. Grace noticed that when she was buying clothes online, for example, the garment would arrive and there might be something that wasn't visible in the online image that made it difficult for her to put on by herself. So this is gathering momentum, and a number of designers are participating, and she sent along a number of models in wheelchairs and with various disabilities for the casting. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens this week.
And they were cast?
Well, as I said, it remains to be seen who is on the runway. I do remember last year, one show had a model, I think she was an athlete, who had a prosthetic limb. I mean, we saw that many years ago in an Alexander McQueen, Amy Mullins, who went on to do TED Talks and things, with an incredible sort of prosthetic leg. We haven't sort of seen it since, but I think we'll probably be seeing a lot more of this week in New Zealand.
Great.
Paddy, thanks so much for coming in.
My
this
pleasure.
morning. Thanks, good to see you.